Let me welcome you all to the second session on access and affordability issues. We're going to be talking today about best practices and challenges, which pretty much includes everything. But we're going to more specifically look at questions of access and affordability as they relate to internet freedom from a variety of perspectives. From a government perspective, from a civil society perspective, from a private sector perspective. We're going to talk very specifically about programs and tools that are now available that address the question of internet freedom from the perspective of access and affordability. We have a fantastic set of panelists who I'm honored to share the stage with. I will ask them first to introduce themselves, but first I'm going to describe a little bit about how we're going to run the session. We have a small group. I would encourage you to move towards the front if you like. I'm going to involve you in the conversation early and often. I'm not going to ask our panelists to make long presentations. I think we all saw enough presentations this morning. We're going to make this into a discussion and a conversation. I'm going to ask our panelists to begin by introducing themselves and describing a little bit about what they do and who they are. They'll do much better justice to their work than I will by providing a long monologue about each of them, because I really want to hear from them. You know, what is it about your work that you do that you feel is most directly impacting internet freedom from the perspective of access and affordability? So I'll begin by introducing myself. My name is Ben Scott. I am the Senior Advisor at the Open Technology Institute in Washington. And I'm also directing a program on technology policy at a Berlin-based think tank called the Stiftung Neue Verantwortung. And my work focuses on, most broadly, international issues of technology policy. So this is something that I care a lot about. I've worked on for many years. So let us begin. Let me start at the end of the dais with Olaf Krona, an old government colleague of mine. Delighted to see you again. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ben. Glad to see you again as well. Yeah, I'm working for the Swedish Minister for Foreign Affairs, dealing with the Internet Freedom Agenda at the Minister's office. That is quite a broad agenda. It also includes cybersecurity issues. We have been up to, we were very much involved in the Human Rights Council resolution last June on stating that freedom or rights, human rights offline should also be applicable online. And we have also during this year been very, very active in getting the EU strategy for cybersecurity, having a lot of human rights references, and I can tell you it has been quite a challenge sometimes, but we are now heading for a goal, and it will be quite a good strategy from the human rights perspective, and also, of course, for the accessibility and affordability perspective, since we are even in the developed Europe, we had issues of both on affordability and accessibility that needs to be solved in order to have a better ICT world than we used to have.
Hello, I'm Sasha Meinrath. I am not on your program. I'm crashing the panel, as it were, at Ben's behest. And my background really comes out of the media justice movement. Spent a number of years working on something called indie media and developing both the communications and decision-making infrastructure there, and also reporting from the streets of protests that were happening all across North America at that period of time. And coming out of that in 2000, I was part of a small group of people that were meeting up and developed something that became the Commotion Wireless Project, popularly known as the Internet in a Suitcase. And I guess the other hat that I wear here on this panel is in 2009, along with Vince Cerf, co-founded something called Measurement Lab, which we will hear from Meredith, our intrepid coordinator of so many things on MLab about as well.
Hello, I'm Karina Risby, and I'm here from the World Wide Web Foundation. And I've only been there for the past month, so I'm quite new to the Web Foundation, but I'm not new to campaigning on issues on human rights, anti-poverty and climate justice, which I've been doing for about 15 years around the world, most recently with Oxfam as the head of digital campaigns there. And interesting enough, my internet cafe hosted the Indie Media Server in Sydney, so we randomly do know each other back in the day. And I think the reason why we're here is because the World Wide Web Foundation sees people being able to access the web as vital for people to be able to lift themselves out of poverty and have the same advantages as everybody else. And I'll go into that a little bit more in detail later.
Hi, I'm Meredith Whitaker. I believe my spokesperson already introduced me a bit. But I am a program manager at Google Research, and my area of specialty there is network measurement. Pertinent to this panel especially, I help manage and support an effort that was founded by MidSurf, the Open Technology Institute, Google, a number of other research and academic and private partners. And this is an effort not only to measure what's going on networks, what is the performance that people are seeing of networks, but also to do that openly. And I think that's key, because that can help provide a language for people who aren't the network operators, a language for people who are trying to create policy that not only encourages human rights, not only encourages access, but policy that has specific directives based on hard data that can be accessed by anyone assessing those.
Good afternoon. My name is Victor Capio. I'm from Kenya. I'm representing Kenya ICT Network, KICTANET, which is a multi-stakeholder forum where different stakeholders meet to discuss ICT policy in the country. At the same time, I work for the Kenyan section of the International Commission of Jurists as a human rights defender, and our key interests are protecting and promoting rule of law, human rights, and democracy in the country.
Thank you. As you can see, we have a huge amount of expertise and a wide diversity of experience on the panel. What I'm going to do is I have a couple of questions that I'm going to begin by asking the panel, and I'll ask any of them who want to answer to take up the challenge of these two questions. But while I'm asking those questions and they're answering, I want all of you to think of the questions that are most pressing for you. And then I'm going to come around with the microphone to anyone that wants to ask a question, and we're going to make this session into a conversation. So the question that I have is one that I think is a struggle for governments, and it's a struggle for lawyers, but it is obvious for civil society and for community groups, and it's this. If you believe that internet freedom is a 21st century human right, if you believe that access to information, access to communication, access to open markets is a fundamental need for social mobility and progress in the modern era, if you believe all those things, does it not follow that government has an obligation to promote access, affordability, and adoption in addition to the protection of human rights on those networks? Is there a government obligation to promote access, affordability, and adoption in the same way that there's a government obligation to defend freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, privacy, and other civil rights on that network? Olaf, would you like to start?
As a politician, I would say definitely yes. It's an indispensable part of the political program in the modern world, definitely. Whether you should put it down in international conventions as a human right, that's another issue, because it's a question of how you define human rights, positively or negatively. But I would definitely say it is a necessary part of every political program if you believe that government would have anything to do with infrastructure as such. And I think, from my personal view, I think it's quite clear they have.
Yeah, if I could build on that, I mean, if you're one of the myriad countries that signed off on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19 states clearly that people have the right to communicate over any media and regardless of frontiers. And so, in a world that now has a global internet, I think if you're a signatory on that, you have a treaty-based responsibility to promote that. It's part of being in a civil society, it's part of being part of a global community of civil societies. And, at what level one prioritizes that should be the real question. Like, is it, going to be the top priority? Is it going to be right under education or above healthcare or whatever else? But it's got to be one of those key elements that every country ascribes to and makes a priority in their top list.
I also think maybe the thing that holds some governments back is the how, particularly for a lot of developing countries. Just how to make that happen is a very real thing when also having to balance up other access to education, access to health, and all those other things as well. And I think there's definitely a role for the wider community to support developing countries in particular to get the how of that sorted out.
And I'll just add to that, I think that is absolutely an issue. We have a situation where there is an ITU definition of broadband that still holds of 256 kilobits per second. Everyone in this room, everyone in the world who accesses the internet knows that that's not broadband, that actually doesn't allow the exercise of these basic human rights as we're talking about it right now. But we're stuck because there is no agreed on forward definition. There is no agreed on new definition. And finding the terms, finding the way to quantify what we mean by access, to quantify what we mean by these tools that allow that access will be key in allowing people to formulate clear and actionable policy that promotes that.
I would agree with what has been said, and just to say that in addition, governments must also understand the extent of that responsibility. That when you talk about internet, when you talk about, let's say, freedom of expression, they know that it also extends to spaces such as the internet, and therefore access to working to provide access to the internet now then also needs to become a priority, and not just looking at it within a very limited framework, but also to understand the wider scope.
So I'll admit that I asked that first question intentionally because I knew what all you would answer. So, okay, we all agree. Access and affordability are obligations for government to promote. Now the question is how? What is the toolbox? Karina is absolutely right. The struggle for government, and I would argue the struggle for this community, the internet freedom community, is how can we marshal the same kind of pressure? How can we build the same kinds of tools to promote access and affordability that we do to promote freedom of expression? So we know the toolbox to promote human rights. It's government-to-government engagement. It's creating a community that presses for norms of responsible behavior in the marketplace and in law enforcement. We know about investing in circumvention technologies. What is the toolbox for promoting access and affordability? And in particular, I want to talk about policy. Meredith, you referenced definitions of broadband matter. If you define broadband as a 64-bit modem, well then everybody's got access in most countries. Done. How do we encourage national governments to make policies that are on the norm of Sweden's fiber everywhere concept? How do we establish a policy recommendation for a developing country that requires hundreds of millions of dollars of investment that none of our governments and no one in our community can possibly come up with? How do we empower local communities with the tools to do for themselves when their telecommunications providers and their governments are unable or unwilling to offer affordable access? What are the tools in our toolbox? What can be done? Victor, you want to start? You look like you have something to say.
Well, I think, just like you said, policy is very, very important. And I usually believe that government must always act in the best interest of the people, but also within the means that is available to them. And of course, talking about other developing countries and the cost of some of these technologies are a bit out of way. But in terms of, we need to have very stable and consistent policy development, which is progressive and dynamic, and takes into consideration the specific needs of the country, but also at the same time appreciating the developments that have gone on in other countries, so that they're not left behind, but at the same time they're trying to also catch up, but remain relevant.
So is that a call for a kind of roadmap of network development? Stages and benchmarks and progress reports?
Yeah, sort of, because countries need to understand the level where they are. So benchmarking becomes very important, and now also developing strategies on how they are going to achieve whatever it is that they want to achieve.
I wonder if I can ask you, Sasha, talk a little bit about the commotion technology that the Open Technology is building, and its sort of dual use, to use a loaded term, as both an internet freedom technology and an affordable access technology.
So first, one has to understand the sort of psychotic and schizophrenic nature of United States government policy. So on the one hand, you have the NSA and PRISM and all of these programs that I and many others believe absolutely contravene international law, but also undermine our fundamental human rights. And if that were the entirety of the nature of the US government, I would be actively seeking a different government. But it's one slice. And in that same government, you then have groups like DRL, Department of Labor and Human Rights, which are actively supporting circumvention technology to route around government surveillance. And this becomes really fascinating to me. It's like the unstoppable force meeting an immovable object kind of conundrum. Now, my work, which is supported in part by the United States government, is to develop free, open source circumvention technologies to ensure that communications is safe, relatively anonymous, and distributed in an ad hoc manner, i.e. that enables people to communicate locally, because we now know, we've established beyond any reasonable doubt that cloud-based communications is irreparably compromised, at least in part by the actions of the United States government. And another facet of the United States government is helping us reestablish safe communications, because this is existent not just in the US, but around the globe in various and sundry different ways. So the Commotion project is what's called a device as infrastructure network. Many of you have cell phones, many of you have laptops and other devices that can be interconnected directly to one another without going through a cell tower, without going out to the cloud, without, in fact, leaving, say, this room or a local neighborhood. And what this empowers people, users, participants in these networks to do is to keep their communications local, to keep it out of the hands of those data collection, monitoring, and surveillance systems, but also to secure it at a level that wouldn't be possible if you had to reach around the globe. As we know, metadata is being collected, so it's now not even just the content of what you've said, but different systems analyses of who you're communicating with, and where that communications is going, and how long it's happening, etc. So I view Commotion as sort of a multi-use technology. On the one hand, because it's reusing equipment that's already on the ground, because you don't have to pay for bandwidth outside of that network if you're communicating locally within that network. It creates very affordable, low-cost communications infrastructure. And then another use case is, and that infrastructure is built in order to route around government surveillance. I cannot think of something that would be more apropos to what's happening globally right now than exactly these forms of communications. And I will end by simply saying Commotion is one of many projects being supported right now to help ensure the safe communications of people around the globe, and including, of course, domestically, back in my homeland, the United States of America.
I do find it a very interesting aspect of the Commotion technology. A technology built specifically for the purpose of promoting internet freedom, to create a secure local area network for people who cannot use the telecommunication service that's offered to them. The test beds for the Commotion network are in inner city Detroit and inner city Philadelphia, because it turns out the same technology is actually a beautiful solution for low-income communities who cannot afford to use the telecommunication service offered in their communities. So this leads me, and I want to ask Olaf to comment on this. What can a foreign ministry do? One like Sweden has taken such a leadership role in internet freedom. What is the role of diplomacy in promoting access and affordability? What's in our toolbox?
Well, of course, one of the prime objectives for us is to build norms, global norms, and to formulate them in order to strengthen the freedom and the universality of the internet. And this we are doing in the multilateral fora, and we are like Geneva or OSCE, wherever. And of course it is a challenge, because there are a number of countries and regimes that do not see things like we do. And they want to use the new technology in order to control their own populations and preserve their own power and preserve the power base. And of course this is not the way that governments in open society works. The idea behind the government in an open society is to protect the individual from the state, not the opposite one. And I think that is a very, very important distinction between governments that believe that they should protect the state from the individual, and open society governments that believe that the state is there to protect the individual from the state, actually. And this is why institutions are so important. And what I would say is often forgotten in the toolbox when we speak about broadband penetration and cell phone penetration is that they need a framework of strong institutions that are not corrupt and have the focus on providing the services, not providing a new tax base or providing a new base for kleptocrats in those regimes. And I think that what we can do as foreign policy people, we can share these experiences, that deregulation is very important, but deregulation must be done in a proper way. That it is very, very important to establish corruption-free zones when you build cell phone systems and cell phone technology that provides people with cell phone technology, broadband technology, etc. And you should create incentives. You should incentivize the build up of the structures and not see it as a potential tax base. The potential tax base will be the activities done by entrepreneurs and business people on the internet. The potential tax base should not be the communication system as such. And I think that is very, very important to make this difference if you want to be successful in introducing ICT in your society.
Very interesting point, and if I can pull out one piece of it, it sounds to me like you are identifying the importance of communications networks as providers of public goods and not just commercial services. And I think that's critically important. And I want to ask Meredith and Serena to comment on this further. How can citizens, consumers, guard against the possibility and the likelihood that governments treat telecommunications service providers as integrated parts of their policy agenda, either for economic or political reasons? What are the mechanisms for accountability? From the simple question of, am I getting what I'm paying for when I buy a broadband service, to the more complicated question of, who's spying on my traffic when I go online? And what is the framework of policies, and how does that framework compare to that of my neighbor, or to that of my region, or to that of the world's leading internet economies?
Small question there. So I think for the Alliance for Affordable Internet, we see this as a really big key issue, and one, it's obviously citizens have to keep the pressure on their governments to be transparent and accountable. That's easier said than done in a lot of countries though. So one of the things that we are doing to help that is to creating an affordability index, an accessibility index, sorry, and that will monitor not only what the price is for each country in terms of GDP and average income, but also what does it actually mean. So for instance, if there's one country where broadband means 256k, whereas another country it might mean it's another limit. And there's also the other cost as well in terms of actual gigabyte downloads, which for people that are low usage or informal users of data pay a lot more. So to put that in perspective, in Mozambique, I think it's $100 per gigabyte for download, which is 2 months the wage of an average farmer. So the cost of internet is too high, and we see that as being the big issue, and that's what we think needs to be concentrated on. In terms of doing that, that can be done in a number of different ways. We don't think there's one solution to fit all countries. It's going to need a combination of private and public, but I think the role of civil society to monitor and to hold both private companies and governments to account on this is really key. I hope that answers part of that question.
Yeah, I think I can just add to that by saying that, you know, holding governments and companies and the people who are owning and administering and regulating this infrastructure to account requires some metric, as we were saying, some milestone, some source of information about, you know, is this actually performing for us? Is this actually giving us what we need as a community, as a country, as, you know, a regional demographic? And that's very difficult for the individual, because is not being able to access Facebook your problem at a given hour, or is that a problem that permeates your neighborhood or your broader community? It's very difficult to understand whether, you know, what is actually going on, and whether these are systemic issues where regulation, where other modes could actually correct it, or whether there may be, you know, problems that are more local and would need other correctives. So I think the key here is having an accessible source of information that people outside of government, outside of telecommunications can access to really vet, are these regulations working for us? Are these processes working for us? Are we getting what we're paying for? Is there evidence, you know, on the line, in the networks, of certain manipulation? Are certain things being systematically blocked? And can we detect that, you know, when we run certain measurements or certain other tests? So I think measurement as a fundamental check on this kind of regulation and this kind of policy is crucial going forward. And not just measurement, because telcos and governments measure all the time, but open measurement, where civil society, where the broader research community, where others who are interested in this are brought into the fold and have access to the data on which these policies rely.
So let me take that an even more concrete step as a sort of call to action. So I think the Internet Freedom Community has got to move to active participation in those kinds of accountability measurements. So you take a look at the Measurement Lab project, which is a consortium of companies and research institutions and public policy organizations from all around the world. Measurement Lab website has a number of different tests that any citizen or consumer can use. And when you click Test My Connection, what you're doing is you're contributing to an open public database of anonymized internet traffic, which not only gives your government and other governments oversight into how well your telecommunications service provider is delivering what you paid for. It's also creating a database that shows all kinds of things about what's going on the internet. So one important project that's going on right now is looking at that data set and trying to see, can we see the digital footprints of surveillance technologies? So that every time you click test my connection, you are taking a step to support internet freedom because you're contributing to a database that will, at scale, show patterns that technologists can say, here we can see this technology is being used to censor the web in this country or this city or this community. Here we can see this surveillance technology. These are the telltale signs. Those are the kinds of tools that, put in the hands of an internet freedom supporting public, I think can begin to make a real difference. So now I want to begin to engage the audience. If you have a question at this stage, please just raise your hand and I will come around and give you the microphone, or someone from the back will give you a microphone. And you can direct your question at any one member of the panel or at the entire panel, and we'll see whether they can give you a good answer. Is there right here in the front?
Thank you. I have one question specifically for Sasha and a larger question to the rest of the panel. Specifically for Sasha is about the viability of mesh networking in sparsely populated or other kinds of difficult to reach communities. So I can see how it will work great in urban communities to provide community access and a separate community layer that currently doesn't exist. But I realized that there was a trial recently in Dharamsala in India, and I'd like to hear about how in difficult to reach communities, how it would work where you need access to at least 2 other nodes. The more general question, and this is something that in the previous panel on access and affordability perspectives from the Global South, also we had some amount of difficulty with, was that knowing the issues, okay, the question of the how, okay, knowing, for instance, that that often spectrum auctioning is seen as a cash cow for governments, okay, so how do we, and the fact that in lots of governments actually spectrum is auctioned, okay, even though there is a growing body of evidence that it might not be the best way of distributing spectrum. So how do you actually address that issue at the policy level? Because what are the best cases to put forward for that? There are lots of other kinds of issues, such as with technologies, there are patents on them, which will make it difficult to move to things like 4G technologies, where in developing countries where lots of patent royalties have to be given out to companies like Qualcomm. How do you work around that? Issues on spectrum licensing, on telecom licensing and universal service obligation, which exist in lots of countries. So it's not as though governments have not tried to get private sector into infrastructure building. Different forms of universal service obligations and funds created for that are specifically targeted at this, but in many countries haven't worked out. So many times due to governance issues, many times due to other kinds of problems. So how do we fix these things that governments have been trying to do for a long time, that private sector can only go so far because there's only so much profitability. How do we actually bridge that gap beyond between profitable access and the others who won't get access?
So let me, as the microphone goes down to Sasha, parse your question into two different segments. One is a question about the effectiveness of mesh technology in rural areas and community wireless networks. Sasha, if you don't mind, spend a minute just explaining about mesh for anyone in the room who's not familiar with the technology. And the second set of questions, which I'll ask Karina to start with, and anybody who'd like to weigh in after that, please do, on this broader second question of telecommunications policy, spectrum policy, patent policy, universal service. How do you transfer best practices in one country to another? Are they transferable? How do you communicate knowledge and capacity into a regulator in one country that is just beginning to tackle these questions? And what tools are in our toolbox to support those processes.
So I've been deploying mesh since 2002, and let me say, for the first several years, totally sucked. It was so difficult to use. Only comp sci folks with extensive knowledge stood any chance whatsoever of building a network. A lot has changed in the last 11 years. A huge number of technological solutions have come into place. A lot of the work that we're doing is looking at the usability of the technologies and improving that, because that's really the great limiter. We now have multiple metro scale and larger meshes around the globe that span large areas. You've got, everything from Funkfoya, which is spanning the entire region of Vienna, Austria. You've got the Athens Wireless Municipal Network, which spans not just Athens, Greece, but over into the islands outside of Athens. That's at awmn.net. You've got GUIFI.net, GUIFI.net. That's covering about 9,300 square kilometers in both Barcelona, but also in the surrounding environment. That's a huge number. It's close to, I think, 30,000 nodes now. So you're talking about major metro and regional scale systems now being possible. And the usability still isn't quite there. It's one of the big deliverables that we have for the commotion work that we're doing. But if you look at what we've developed, so the Dharamsala deployment that you mentioned, one day you go from bringing a bunch of people into a couple of rooms together, working on this, failing in the afternoon to get it to fully functional, and then by the evening networking their hotels together and having a network spanning that area in one day. And what we're doing in Detroit with the Digital Stewards program, where we're training people with no technical capacity whatsoever on how to use, deploy, and expand these kinds of networks, using, in essence, technologies that have been proved out in the field all around the globe, but then adding a layer of usability to them that hasn't existed before. And these are sea changes. If you look at the business models today for broadband and communications writ large, they're predicated on few users with a high average return per user, expensive connectivity for very few numbers of people. If you're looking at, well, we want to connect the other 5 billion people on the planet, the business model has to shift. And the way you do that is through community-owned infrastructure, making a trade-off to say, look, if you have time, you don't need money. If you have the capacity to put up a television aerial, well, now you can put up a broadband communications infrastructure in your rural village. And that can communicate both locally within that network, but then you can also do things like buy bandwidth in bulk and share it. You can use extra bandwidth that might be bought by, say, an NGO, but is not used when they close their offices at night, and share that. A whole host of different kinds of business models that become possible to dramatically lower the cost of connectivity by an order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude. And that really is what's fundamentally important if you're talking about getting the other 3/4 of the planet online in a meaningful way.
Karina, do you want to start on the big policy question?
Yeah, and I think you could see it as you can see the policy as a massive challenge, but I like to see it as a massive opportunity. I think the use of best practice is possibly, and showing the benefits to countries of what happens when you do get it right, I think is the opportunity that we have. And if you look at Kenya, if you look at South Korea, if you look at Mexico and see what has actually been able to happen when transparency is a lot more open, when policies are updated to reflect technology and what people want, and when also there's a better working relationship between private business, civil society and governments, you can see the benefits. So for instance, Kenya's gone from 22% of people to be accessing the web in December 11 to the start of January being close to 40%. So that's a massive growth in just over 2 years. And what that has also meant is that people can also access different services, the m-banking experience as well as, again, another example of what can happen. And I think taking these best practices and going through the different political and also corporate associations and groupings to share them and to find solutions of how they can be developed would be the best way forward, I think. Particularly getting groups like GSMA involved and to particularly find the points where everyone can agree on and work from there rather than trying to fight the points that no one agrees on, and then finding those moments.
Victor, is Kenya an example the world can learn from, or is an inside view bring you more skepticism?
I think that there's some good examples because even as Skipternet, the platform has enabled a lot of public-private partnership because we have government in the forum, we have private sector, we have any other person who is concerned with the ICT policy discussing and debating these issues as they come. And even as of now, the government is planning to introduce laptops free to primary schools to all standard 1 pupils in January next year. And this is an issue for debate, is like what form should it take, what laptops, open source, licensed, HP, Samsung, local, university made, and so these kind of discussions really help to shape the kind of policies that ultimately, and now the government is starting to rethink, maybe they're saying, why not we just open computer labs in all the schools as opposed to giving laptops, because that is a bigger priority. We have teachers now reining into the issue because now it's a public debate saying that we need more teachers, not more laptops. But very importantly is that through PPPs, there is need for understanding of the roles and sort of have like a scratch my back, a scratch yours. If government gives an incentive for business, for example, I'll give an example of Kenya. For example, the government removed taxation on mobile phones some time back. And what this happens is that people bought phones. And so they needed network. So the service providers now had to invest in providing the base stations. And as time moved on, people buy smartphones and people say, okay, we need faster internet on this thing. So, hey, service provider, either you bring us fast internet or we shift to the next. So there has to be that kind of balanced relationships. At the same time, government must also invest because we also must look at these issues from a human rights based. The governments must take a human rights based approach into service delivery, and in places where, for example, there's non-internet, then government can invest. And for example, in Kenya, the government invested in having the fiber cable brought to Kenya and also laying a network across the country. So there are various ways and different approaches, but I think there are one or two things which could be learned from Kenya.
I want to come back to this question of demand and incentives for adoption later, and I'm going to bring in Olaf and Meredith momentarily, but first I want to see if there are other questions from the group. Andrew, and then these two gentlemen over here. Maybe I'll take all three questions at once, and then I'll come to the panel.
Thanks, Ben. I just wanted to, challenge the easy consensus you got on the first question, because it's always a bit dangerous when everybody agrees. I think there must be something a little bit worth interrogating. If I was, say, a chief advisor to the president of a developing country, and somebody said to me, if the internet should be a human right, I would think in terms of a legal claim against my government, made by a citizen to provide something. And I would think of the demand for clean water, for health, education, for jobs and economic growth, for dealing with climate change, agricultural reform. And I think, do I really want to add a legal obligation to my government in the middle of all these demands? So I guess my question to the panel is, isn't it more, and I'm a human rights person, so I love the concept of human rights, but I wonder if it's more effective in terms of the incentives for adoption that you're talking about, to approach governments and say, actually the way to solve, or at least begin to tackle, some of those other key problems you have around economic development, around health and education, around effective use of resources, reducing transaction costs on banking as they found in Kenya, isn't that a more productive line of argument, utilitarian functional case for developing internet access, than trying to bring in the human rights argument, which I think raises a whole set of other questions for political leaders throughout the world, particularly in the global south, who often see it as something that people in the north do to them, rather than something that they develop themselves.
Okay, panel, mental note, the principle versus the functional argument for internet access in public policy. Let me take these two questions and then we'll come to the panel for answers to all of them. Gentlemen here.
So, my name is Ali and I'm in the Iranian group called ASO19. We're very interested in commotion and mesh network. My question is, and I apologize, I came in late, maybe you already explained. Have you been thinking of how we can connect this mesh network to the cloud outside of Iran, to networks outside of Iran? And if you have done it, can you explain a little bit how it's going to work?
Okay, Sasha, you're queued up for that one.
My question is also to Sasha, actually. So when you mentioned AWM and GUI, were they examples of users of the commotion technology, or were they just examples of mesh networking in general? Then I'd like you to give some typical use cases that could incentivize mesh networking for users that don't really care about their privacy or data flows. And finally, how long will it take me to build a mesh network that could enable me to have encrypted phone of a radius of, say, 10 kilometers?
Okay, we're going to start with Andrew's question, and I'm going to begin with Olaf, because I know you spent a lot of time wrestling with this question.
Yeah, actually, it was exactly why I said that it would be an indispensable part of a political program, but not a legal, convention-based human right. I think it's building the ICT infrastructure in the country is one of the most fantastic things a government can do for itself, actually, because it everyone who don't believe me could read the McKinsey report from 2012 on ICT in aspiring countries, which they prefer to call developing countries, call them aspiring countries instead, which shows very clearly that, for example, for every lost job in ICT, they gain 3.2 jobs in SMEs in the aspiring countries, compared to 1.9 job gain in the developed countries. So the leverage of ICT investments is tremendous in developing countries. And of course, the basic incentive for a government who wants to stay in power is to deliver better standards of living, better opportunities for its citizens, and ICT investments is the best tool ever to do it, actually. So the incentives for the government to do it right is, I would say, strong. The problem is that the incentives for individuals in governments to do it wrong is also very strong. And here you have the corruption factor. And we try now from my government to develop a combined package of institutional consultancies and hardware and software consultancies for governments who feel that they need a partner to develop the ICT systems, not only technologically, not only with regard to software, but also with regard to the institutions. Which I think that the institutional factor has been a neglected one so far in many of the countries. And the problem now is that if they want to institutional advice, they often go to countries that give them the wrong advice with regard to institutional capacity.
Let me follow up on Andrew's question, and then I have a question for you, Meredith. Olaf, when you're thinking about the kind of foreign policy support for building ICT systems, you mentioned software consultancy, hardware consultancy, policy framework consultancy. If you're taking a functional approach, to use Andrew's term, is it dangerous to marry that to the principled approach of human rights? If you're dealing with a government that is perhaps open, if not enthusiastic about your functional approach, but skeptical about your human rights agenda?
Well, from my point of view, and I think that we can give quite a good case actually, it has, Andrew said it, it's a marriage between human rights and other positive aspects on the internet. This is the fantastic thing with open societies actually, that freedom underpins growth, freedom underpins security, and security is a way to safeguard freedom. And that's why when I'm talking on this matter, I always say that context actually matters. There are differences between certain kind of regimes with regard to the constitutional context. This goes also for the growth policy. So even if I have a functional approach to it, it's functional because it serves as human rights in the, at the end of the day, in the final end. And I think that open societies all over the world, in the developing countries just as in developed countries, have here the same experience, that there is no contradiction between the functionality of growth and the principle of human rights. In fact, the functionality of growth makes it easier for us to realize the principle of human rights.
Meredith, I'm interested in your views on this question of the marriage between growth and principle in advocacy on human rights. And also, more concretely, do you see Measurement Lab primarily as a tool that prods functional development of better networks for the sake of better service, irrespective of the kind of contents being delivered? Or do you see it from an internet freedom perspective, now that you're developing UniPro, the tools that are designed to detect surveillance and censorship? Or is it both? And if it's both, how do you sell those two together inside of the same public service tool?
So I think it is both. I think that, actually the growth of networks and the evolution of networks and the evolution of this technology is closely technologically wed to internet freedom. We decide on a new routing standard, we decide on a new address policy, we decide on any number of, what would be arcane technical details to a number of people. Those determine internet freedoms. And so understanding this in a more holistic view, that the evolution of what we choose to implement, what technologies we choose to rely on, actually form and, in a way, dictate the freedoms that we are able to exercise using those technologies. I would come back to Andrew's question and to give my view that I actually don't think defining internet as a human right makes sense because of this. Because, in 25 years, if we have some breakthrough technology we call the AstralNet or the extranet, and we still have an instantiated definition of the internet as a human right, that's the 64-bit modem. That's the 256 kilobit broadband connection. That is a very convenient way for people who are with resisting change, resisting evolution, to check a box of success and not actually move forward to the new technology that is the enabler of these basic human rights. So that would be my view on that question.
Sasha, bucket of questions to clarify on mesh deployment.
So I think I got them all, but I am actually going to start by quickly addressing Andrews, because having talked with ministers in a number of countries, is basically the 4 points that I give them. One is, connectivity is the force multiplier for your education, for your medicine, for your economic activity writ large, and for human rights. It's a multi-use phenomenon that accelerates your entire economy and your entire social world. Number 2 is that spectrum is the force multiplier for all this connectivity. And number 3 is that, especially within developing countries, they're sitting on a virtual gold mine of spectrum. The underdevelopment, if you will, has led to vast swaths of underutilized or completely non-utilized spectrum. So you have bands that are allocated for radio telescopes in countries that have no radio telescopes. You've got bands for naval radar in landlocked countries. You've got television spectrum and no over-the-air broadcast. You've got all of these areas where they've harmonized with the ITU, which is harmonized with the United States, for uses that simply don't exist. So the fourth thing is like the television white space stuff, cognitive software-defined radio that's coming online. All of this allows for the opportunistic reuse or use of all of these bands that are under or unutilized right now today. And the trick then is to say, wow, we have this enormous national resource. Let's put it to use. Now to go to the specifics of Commotion. So I've been working on this for 13 years. And over those 13 years, I've made a lot of connections with the best developers on the planet doing various facets of technological, open source, mesh wireless technological development. What Commotion is actually sort of a connection between a number of these different projects. So to say, is it Commotion that they're using? They're using different facets of Commotion because Commotion is composed of the best route prioritization metrics and the best, optimization metrics and Serval, so the best, distributed VoIP technology systems that we can find. I'm not saying we found them all, it's the ones that we have found thus far in the past 13 years. And it's built to be modular and extensible so you can keep plugging in as you find better technologies. It's built open source through and through, so you keep adding in special sauce to meet the specific local needs for that population. And then all of that is wrapped in sort of a nice graphical user interface and a nice, relatively intuitive, easy to use system. So the quick answer is, yes, it's all Commotion because Commotion is part and parcel of these technologies. In terms of how long does it take to set up a mesh that could span, I think it was 10 kilometers and do VoIP calls. We actually connected, I guess it was friends of mine connected Vienna, Austria into Slovenia and Croatia over about 130 kilometers, and we're making calls over that in about 3 hours. The problem isn't distance. We have technology right now. You take a off-the-shelf Ubiquity radios and you can span 10 kilometers immediately. The problem is really about the skills share to extend and build and maintain these kinds of networks once they've been built. And so it's really not a question of the technological deployment, it's more one of the building local ownership and getting the skills to local communities to set up, build, maintain, extend these networks. But yeah, I mean, it's fast. The suite of tools we are implementing with Commotion, sort of the default tools, again, all open source, freely available, will include a VoIP system. It will include some of the Serval technology, which is a group out of Australia. It's designed a distributed phone-based VoIP system that runs off of your existing cell phones and will integrate into Commotion Mesh. We're doing a bunch of even more disruptive elements that I'm not going to talk about while the camera is running, but see me afterwards and I'd be happy to swap notes with you.
So I have another question from the audience. We're running out of time. We have a few minutes left. I'm going to judge when we should close by the roar outside the door, because I don't want any of you to miss the plenary session. But the gentleman in the middle has a question.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Charles from Kenya. It's not necessarily a question, but it's a point of sharing in terms of, especially to share with the speakers here, as far as the accessibility and affordability is concerned, and we tend to bring the government in, and as far as we are gearing to see the freedom on how to use the internet. Actually, as we see this thing, is that, in my own point of view, is that, yes, there's no connection between the human rights and then the rights and then the use of internet. Though sometimes we tend, the human rights activists, maybe, I can say, when the government maybe points out the use of internet software, the human activists maybe you say, okay, but now why provide internet and that freedom of internet instead of providing maybe food on the table, this and this. And that's what Victor said. That's in Kenya right now we are the president just said, okay, we want to roll out the distribution of the laptops. You see, a person who was not that importance of the internet, unless the government acknowledges the importance of it, first of all, then we can't speak of freedom of internet, because not all will be able to understand the same thing. And if I may just use the country, my own country, to make it affordable and also accessible, because it can be there, yes, but you can't be able to pay it. Yes, it's the role of the government to do it, and that's why the moment now, when it becomes expensive, we will say now, you see what now? The government is not doing its role. Maybe the government has struggled to bring it.
Like the khanacademy.org, which has the whole curriculum for young kids, is of course also an immense resource. The problem here is, of course, that it's still very much based on English, and you need, in order to really expand the adoption, you need to have internet services on local languages, and you need programming skills among people who speak other languages than English and French and German, Chinese.
You made the challenge for our fellow panelists difficult. So Olaf has mentioned as forces to drive adoption: security, transparency, trust and credibility, educational opportunities, and local language content. Sasha, you're allowed to underline those that Olaf has brought up.
Yes, so I'll just say every study that's been done on this has identified 3 areas that are the major reasons why people don't adopt. Number 1 is cost. We talked about business modeling and the need to dramatically lower the cost of this, clearly. The second is fear, which Olaf talked about, and then the flip side of that, which is ensuring safe communications, ensuring that the locus of control over those communications resides with the end users, not with some middleman or cloud-based system or whatever else. And the third is salience. We learned this the hard way about 8 years ago, doing some work in Ghana, and realizing that free text messaging means nothing in rural villages where you have pretty much 0% literacy rate. The killer application then was very short voicemail that could be sent throughout the network. And so, it's great that we have this global communication system. Free phone calls to everywhere on the planet means very little to somebody that just needs to communicate within their village, because everyone they know is in that village. And if you can make that communication free, that becomes a killer application. So we need to think very differently about what the salience looks like to that long tail, the vast quantity of people on Earth, where the profit gleanable is teeny, tiny, versus the small little group that has a lot of disposable income, which is what every business model targets today. So cost, overcoming fear, and making these things salient.
Thanks. Karina.
And you've both covered a lot of my things, so I agree with what you both said. And I think in terms of the network, is making sure the network gets to the end of the line. So the network isn't just for, as Sasha said, that people have money. The network gets to the end of the line and everyone has universal access to it. If anyone's ever tried to get anyone to use an intranet at work, you know that if 100% of the people don't use the intranet, everyone still has to use email for the 2% that refuse to use the intranet. So it's really about getting 100% of the people having access. And I think I can't state clearly enough, it's really about finding those killer apps that make people want to use it and they have to use it. So in a lot of M-Pesa was that first really obvious killer app. In country, in rural communities, it's something to test. It's weather, finding out about weather, and getting access to those killer apps will make them more curious about things that they can, other things they can do with it. And I also think that sharing best practice will also help. So whether it's within a country or within a regional block, sharing what worked and what didn't, so people can get to the adoption phase a lot faster, would be a great help as well.
So I think I would echo that point of salience and sort of bring into that context. So understanding not only, adoption as a broad concept, but adoption within specific regional and other contexts does this network that is provided work for the people there to do what they need? Does it work to communicate securely within a 10-mile radius? Does it work to communicate within a village? And I think that, again, will take an understanding of what the underlying network performance and technology is, paired with a ground truth understanding of what these people there actually would want to do with it. Why would they adopt? What would this do for them that is useful? And I would encourage people to look at the Measurement Lab website, measurementlab.net, and just, any of the researchers in the room, we have about 740 terabits of data freely available that have been measured globally, which can begin to give this kind of broad picture that then brings those specific contextual instances into a brighter focus, because we have this very clear data on what networks are actually doing there, and then we can develop an understanding of whether they're serving the needs of the people who would be accessing them.
I guess I reiterate the sentiments of the earlier speakers, but probably just to point out that ultimately, bars to access need to be removed, whether they are legal. The questions of whether it's surveillance that brings about fear of using systems or cloud services or Gmail or whatever. Costs need to be lowered. We need investment, and of course, it's the question of net neutrality. And the other thing is that we must promote innovation, because when there's innovation, and best has been pointed out, which is an example of necessity is the mother of invention. We must also show the public that there is some benefit and there's something that the net can do for you, or there's a way in which it can change your life, or you can use it to change your life. Once you appreciate the benefit, then you also create a demand for the adoption of whichever technologies. Government must appreciate the right and duty. I know there was a question of utilitarianism, that these two go hand in hand. Do not compromise on the human right, but at the same time, we also do not compromise on the technical standard. All of them must be improving at the same time, and also bring people to be aware of the socio-economic benefits, whether it's going to increase the business or improve society, help in exchange of culture. These things are also very key for adoption.
Thank you. Well, we're out of time. The plenary will begin shortly. I encourage you all to attend. It should be sparks may fly as the panelists debate the big questions in front of us today. But first, I hope you'll join me in thanking our wonderful panel for a great session.